The silver platter sitting on my kitchen counter had been polished until I could see my own reflection in it. I was staring at an old man with deep lines carved into his forehead, calloused hands that had worked 40 years in heavy construction, and eyes that held the kind of quiet sadness only a parent who has been forgotten can truly understand. It was 7 o'clock on Thanksgiving morning. Outside, the cold November wind was howling through the bare branches of the oak trees in my front yard, sweeping yellow leaves across the driveway of my small brick house in Ohio. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 68 years old. For 4 decades, I woke up at 5 in the morning, wore steel-toed boots, and poured concrete foundations for towering skyscrapers, office parks, and luxury housing developments across the state. I ruined my lower back, tore the cartilage in both knees, and worked 12-hour shifts in freezing rain and scorching summer heat so my son, David, would never have to swing a hammer. And David had done well. In fact, he had done better than well. At 34, David was the chief executive officer of Pendleton and Vance Capital, a high-stakes commercial real estate firm based in the wealthiest district of Columbus. He lived in an $8 million gated mansion on the river, wore custom-tailored Italian suits, and drove a sports car that cost more than my first home. His wife, Victoria, was the daughter of a prominent state politician. She looked at the world through gold-rimmed designer sunglasses and spoke to service staff like they were transparent. For 3 years, I had barely seen my son. A quick text message on my birthday, a brief 5-minute phone call on Father's Day where I could hear his secretary whispering meeting reminders in the background. That was all that remained of the boy who used to sit on my shoulders at county fairs and ask me how buildings were made. When David called me 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, my heart had lifted for the first time since my wife, Mary, passed away 4 years ago. "Dad," David had said, his voice clipped and fast. "We're hosting the annual Thanksgiving gala at the estate this year. We've got high-profile investors coming from Chicago and New York. Victoria wants everything catered, but I remember how Mom used to make that apple cinnamon pie with a salted crust. Can you bake 2 of those and bring them over around 5 o'clock? My hands had trembled with joy when I heard those words. He was inviting me home. He wanted a piece of his mother's kitchen, a piece of our humble past, at his grand table. "Of course, son," I had said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll make 3. I'll make sure they're fresh out of the oven." For 2 days straight, I prepared. I went to the local orchard to hand-pick the crispest apples. I spent hours rolling dough, blending spices, and carefully crusting the edges just the way Mary had taught me 40 years ago. I pulled my one good navy blazer out of the closet, brushed off the dust, ironed my trousers, and polished my brown leather shoes. I wasn't going to a grand party to impress billionaires. I was going to see my son. I was going to hold my 6-year-old granddaughter, Chloe, whom I hadn't been allowed to visit in over 8 months. At 4:30 in the afternoon, with the 3 pies carefully wrapped in thermal towels on my passenger seat, I drove my 10-year-old pickup truck up the long, winding cobblestone driveway of David's estate. The property was blindingly magnificent. Floodlights illuminated marble fountains, manicured lawn gardens, and a fleet of pristine luxury cars, Ferraris, Bentleys, and dark limousines, parked along the circular driveway. Valets in black vests were running back and forth, opening doors for men in tuxedos and women in velvet evening gowns. I felt out of place in my rusty truck, but I smiled to myself, holding the warm silver tray of pies close to my chest as I walked up the grand stone steps to the front entrance. The heavy mahogany doors were open, revealing a foyer with a crystal chandelier that threw brilliant prisms of light across white marble floors. Live violin music drifted through the warm air, mixed with the clinking of champagne flutes and refined laughter. I stepped inside, my worn leather shoes making a soft sound against the tile. "Grandpa!" a small, sweet voice called out. I looked up and saw little Chloe standing near the grand staircase in a velvet red dress. My heart swelled. I set the heavy tray on a side console table and knelt down, opening my arms. "Hey there, my little lady," I whispered, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. "Look how big you've grown." Chloe ran toward me, her arms outstretched, but before she could reach me, a pair of manicured hands grabbed her shoulders and pulled her back sharply. It was Victoria. She was wearing an emerald green silk dress, diamonds glittering at her throat. Her face contorted in immediate disgust as she looked down at me. "Chloe, Go upstairs to the nanny right now, Victoria snapped, shoving the little girl toward the stairs. Then she turned her glare to me, holding her hand over her nose as if she smelled rotten milk. Arthur, what on earth are you doing in the main foyer? And what are you wearing? Victoria, I said, standing up stiffly, my knees cracking. I brought the pies David asked for. They're still warm. Pies! Victoria let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Arthur, look around you. The governor's chief of staff is in the drawing room. The managing directors of Vanguard Global are on the patio. We have a 3-star Michelin catering crew in the kitchen. We don't need homemade apple pies sitting on silver trays like we're at a farm carnival. Before I could speak, David stepped out of the lounge, holding a glass of aged scotch. He was surrounded by 3 men in tailor-made dark suits. When his eyes fell on me, his smile instantly froze. He whispered something to his associates, stepped away, and hurried over with a dark frown on his face. Dad, David pulled me roughly by the elbow toward the coat alcove near the front door, away from the eyes of his guests. What are you doing here right now? I looked at my son, confusion clouding my mind. David, you called me. You asked me to bring your mother's pies for Thanksgiving. David rubbed his forehead, glancing anxiously over his shoulder toward the living room where wealthy guests were chatting. I said bring them to the back door before 4 o'clock, Dad. David hissed in a low, furious whisper. I didn't tell you to dress up and walk through the front entrance in front of my investors. The words hit me like a physical blow. The warm air in the foyer suddenly felt ice cold. The back door, I repeated, my voice shaking. David, I'm your father. I thought I was joining you for dinner. David let out a harsh, exasperated sigh. He looked at my polished but worn blazer, my weathered face, and my hands that had paid for his college tuition at Georgetown University. Dad, be realistic for once in your life, David said, leaning in close, his voice cold and cutting. Look around this room. These are high-net-worth individuals, people who control billions in capital. This isn't a small family gathering. It's an exclusive networking event for important guests. You don't fit in here. You'd make people uncomfortable with your old union talk and construction stories. Important guests, I whispered, staring into the eyes of the boy I had tucked into bed every night for 15 years. I'm not important enough to sit at your table. David reached into a suit jacket, pulled out his wallet, and extracted $300 bills. He tried to shove them into my jacket pocket. Take this, Dad, David said quickly, avoiding my eyes. Go to that nice steakhouse down on 5th Street. Treat yourself to a good meal. Leave the pies on the kitchen counter through the service entrance and head home. I'll call you next week, okay? I looked down at the money in my pocket. Then I looked at my son. In that single, quiet moment, something inside me, something that had loved him unconditionally through every second of his life, snapped into cold, unbreakable crystal. I pulled the $300 bills out of my pocket, dropped them onto the marble floor at his feet, and picked up my silver tray of pies. Keep your money, David, I said softly, my voice devoid of anger, holding only a quiet, absolute finality. Enjoy your important guests. I turned around, walked out the front doors, and stepped down the grand stone stairs into the freezing rain. As I started my old truck, I looked up at the glowing windows of the mansion. David was standing by the glass, holding his scotch, already laughing at a joke one of his wealthy investors had made. He thought he had swept his past under the rug. He thought his humble old father was just a quiet relic he could toss aside without consequence. He had no idea that the land his $8 million mansion was built on, the corporate building his firm operated out of, and the primary investment fund, keeping his company solvent, didn't belong to the bank. They belonged to a silent holding trust, and the man who held the master key was sitting right here in this rusty pickup truck. The drive back to my empty house was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. The only sound was the dull thrum-thrum of my tires against the cold asphalt and the heavy rain beating against the roof of the cab. On the seat beside me, the silver platter of apple pies sat untouched, gradually losing their warmth, just like the home I had built for my family 40 years ago. When I arrived, I didn't turn on the porch light. I walked into the dark living room, hung my wet blazer on the wooden coat rack, and sat down in the leather armchair by the cold fireplace. Mary's framed portrait sat on the side table. In the photo, taken 20 years ago at a union picnic, she was laughing, her hand resting gently on my shoulder while a 10-year-old David proudly held up a small plastic trophy from his Little League game. "You knew, didn't you, Mary?" I whispered to the dark room. "You always warned me that we were giving him too much of the world without teaching him how to stand on the ground." David believed he had built his own success. He loved to tell reporters from business magazines about how he had started from scratch, rising through the ranks of corporate finance on sheer grit and intellect. He liked the narrative of the self-made prodigy. It was a beautiful lie. What David never knew, what I had intentionally kept hidden from him to protect his pride, was the real origin of Pendleton and Vance Capital. 35 years ago, long before David entered college, I wasn't just a construction worker swinging a hammer. I was a senior site supervisor for Midstate Infrastructure, the largest commercial development group in Ohio. Over 4 decades of hard, dangerous labor, I had saved every spare dollar. But more importantly, I had bought land. Whenever a municipality put up blighted, abandoned industrial lots for public tax auctions in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I bought them. While other men bought new cars or took vacations, I bought forgotten acreage along drainage canals, rusty railroad spurs, and gravel backroads across Columbus. Everyone thought I was crazy, buying worthless dirt. They didn't see what was coming. I knew where the highways were going to expand. I knew where the state legislature was planning the new Outer Belt bypass. By the time David graduated from Georgetown with his shiny finance degree, my quiet little portfolio of hidden deeds was worth millions. When David wanted to launch his firm, he couldn't get a bank loan. The major financial institutions looked at a 26-year-old kid with zero collateral and turned him down cold. He came home to our small kitchen table, put his face in his hands, and wept. I didn't give him a handout. That night, I called my lifelong friend and former boss, Senator Richard Vance, a man whose life I had saved 30 years earlier on a collapsed bridge construction site in Cincinnati. Richard and I created an anonymous master entity called the Anchor Heritage Trust. I transferred 60% of my land holdings into the trust as collateral, securing a $50 million institutional credit line for David's firm. The trust provided 40% of his direct operational capital, guaranteed his major corporate leases, and quietly backed every multi-million-dollar bond his firm issued to secure high-net-worth clients. I made Richard the sole public trustee. I placed one strict condition on the legal agreement. David was never to be told that his father was the sole benefactor and controller of Anchor Heritage. I wanted my son to feel tall. I wanted him to walk into boardrooms with confidence, believing his own talent had opened the doors. I had planned to hand over the master trust to him on his 40th birthday, a final gift from a father who loved him more than life itself. I sat forward in the dark, my old joints aching, and reached into the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out a heavy, navy blue leather binder stamped with a gold seal, Anchor Heritage Trust, Executive Deed of Control. Inside were the original deeds, the master corporate guarantees, and the voting share certificates for Pendleton and Vance Capital. David didn't own his $8 million estate on the river. The estate was held under a long-term lease agreement managed by a subsidiary of Anchor Heritage. David didn't own the glass skyscraper on 4th Street where his corner office sat. The entire building belonged to Anchor Heritage, and 62% of the high-net-worth liquidity pool keeping his firm afloat for his important guests was backed directly by the sovereign assets sitting in this very binder. My son had stood in his grand foyer, looked at my worn boots, and told me I wasn't an important guest at his table. He had thrown $300 bills on the floor to buy my absence. He had forgotten the fundamental rule of engineering. If you disrespect the foundation, the entire structure will collapse on your head. I reached for my phone, dialed a private 10-digit number, and put the receiver to my ear. It picked up on the second ring. "Arthur?" A deep, gravelly voice spoke from the speaker. It was Senator Richard Vance. Even at 72, retired from the Senate, and living on his estate in Virginia, his voice carried the commanding authority of a man who had shaped state politics for 4 decades. "It's late, my friend. Is everything all right?" "Richard," I said softly, staring at the navy binder under the yellow lamplight. "I need you to call a board meeting of Anchor Heritage for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. There was a long pause on the line. Richard knew me better than almost anyone alive. He heard the quiet, cold tone in my voice, a tone I hadn't used since we were managing hundreds of steelworkers in the dead of winter. "What did he do, Arthur?" Richard asked quietly, He chose his guests, I replied. Now it's time for him to meet his landlord. Friday morning arrived with a clear, sharp frost that turned the grass along the highway into sheets of diamond glass. At 8 o'clock in the morning, inside the top-floor corner office of Pendleton and Vance Capital, David was nursing a hangover from his extravagant Thanksgiving gala. He was sitting behind his massive polished mahogany desk, wearing a charcoal gray suit, reviewing the quarterly financial projections with his chief operating officer, Marcus Sterling. The party was a complete triumph, Marcus, David said, taking a sip of black espresso from a china cup. The governor's chief of staff assured me they're approving the zoning permits for the new riverfront development by Tuesday. Once that goes through, our management fees alone will double by Q1. That's great news, David, Marcus replied, though his tone was unusually guarded. He was holding a thick manila folder stamped with a bright red urgency seal. Except we have a sudden issue. Something came through the secure wire from the trustee's office 20 minutes ago. David frowned, setting his coffee cup down with a soft clack. What trustee? Anchor Heritage. Yes, Marcus said, laying the document on the desk. They've issued an emergency special audit and voting session for 9 o'clock this morning in our primary boardroom. Every senior partner is required to attend. David let out an annoyed chuckle, tossing his pen onto his desk. An audit? Now. Old Senator Vance hasn't called an emergency meeting in 5 years. The man is 72 and living in Virginia. What could he possibly want on the morning after Thanksgiving? I don't know, Marcus said, looking uneasy. But the notice wasn't signed by a secretary. It was executed directly under Section 12 of the Master Sovereign Trust Deed. David, Section 12 allows the controlling benefactor to immediately freeze all operational credit lines if a breach of fiduciary integrity is suspected. David's smile vanished. The color drained slightly from his face. Freeze our credit lines? We have $40 million tied up in earnest money deposits for the riverfront land. If those credit lines are frozen for even 24 hours, the seller's escrow defaults, and we lose the entire project. Then I suggest you get down to the main boardroom right now, Marcus warned. Because Senator Vance's private jet landed at the municipal airport 40 minutes ago. He's already in the building. At 8:55, David walked briskly down the carpeted hallway of the executive floor. His heart was beating with a strange, uncomfortable rhythm. He adjusted his silk tie, took a deep breath, and put on his most confident corporate smile. He pushed open the heavy double-glass doors of the grand conference room. The room was vast, dominated by a 30-foot conference table made of reclaimed black walnut, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the downtown Columbus skyline. Seated around the table were the firm's top 6 senior partners, all looking pale, anxious, and bewildered. Sitting at the far head of the table, wearing a crisp tailored navy wool suit with a silver pocket square, was Senator Richard Vance. His posture was military straight, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the doors as David entered. Senator Vance! David exclaimed, extending his hand as he strode forward with manufactured warmth. What an unexpected honor! If I had known you were coming to Ohio for the holidays, I would have invited you to my estate for Thanksgiving dinner last night. We had an extraordinary turnout of important guests. Senator Vance did not stand up. He did not extend his hand. He simply looked at David's outstretched hand with a cold, piercing stare until David slowly let his arm drop to his side. I don't care about your dinner, David, Senator Vance said, his voice deep and echoing like a hammer against anvil. And I certainly don't care about your important guests. David cleared his throat, feeling a sudden prickle of cold sweat at the back of his neck. He took his seat at the opposite end of the table. Senator, I don't understand the emergency, David said, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. Our numbers are up 12% this quarter. The riverfront acquisition is 90% complete. Pendleton and Vance Capital has never been more profitable. Pendleton and Vance Capital does not belong to you, David, Senator Vance said flatly, leaning forward and resting his hands on the walnut table. You own 38% of the voting shares. The remaining 62%, as well as the building you are currently sitting in, the land beneath your home, and the primary liquidity reserve funding your developments, belongs to Anchor Heritage Trust. Of course I know that, David said, waving his hand impatiently. And as the principal trustee, you've always supported our growth. I am the trustee, David, Senator Vance interrupted sharply, his voice slicing through the quiet room. I am the manager. I am not the benefactor. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the boardroom. The 6 senior partners looked at one another in confusion. David frowned, his brow furrowing. The benefactor? What are you talking about? The trust was established by an anonymous institutional investor 35 years ago. You've always kept the benefactor's identity private under the non-disclosure covenant. The covenant was valid as long as the benefactor believed you were a man of character, Senator Vance said, pulling a leather binder from his briefcase and sliding it to the center of the table. A man who understood that a house built without respect for its foundation will not stand. Senator Vance looked toward the double glass doors at the back of the room. And as of 7 o'clock last night, the senator added softly, the benefactor decided to handle his portfolio personally. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Every head in the room turned. Walking slowly into the glass boardroom, wearing a neat, iron dark blazer, polished brown leather shoes, and holding a simple wooden cane, was my father, Arthur Pendleton. David's jaw dropped. His eyes widened in absolute, staggering disbelief. He half rose from his chair, his voice cracking into a high, bewildered pitch. Dad! David gasped, staring at him as if he were looking at a ghost. What are you doing here? How did you even get past security downstairs? My father didn't answer right away. He walked with a slow, measured step, the soft clack-clack of his cane echoing against the hardwood border of the room. He didn't look angry. He didn't look bitter. He looked like the man who had poured the foundation of every skyscraper on the block. Solid, unyielding, and completely unshakable. He walked straight to the head of the table, where Senator Vance immediately stood up, pulled out the high-backed leather chair, and bowed his head slightly in deep, genuine respect. Thank you, Richard, my father said softly, taking the master chair at the head of the boardroom table. David stood frozen by his seat, his mind struggling to comprehend the scene unfolding before his eyes. The senator, a former U.S. senator and multimillionaire, was standing behind an old, retired construction worker like a junior aide. Dad! David stammered, his face turning pale. What is this? Is this some kind of joke? My father slowly folded his hands on top of the black walnut table. He looked around the room at the senior partners, then finally rested his clear, gray eyes directly on his son. 35 years ago, David. My father spoke, his voice calm, deep, and steady. I started buying worthless dirt across the city with money I earned breaking my back in the winter mud. When you needed $50 million to open these doors, I didn't give you a handout. I gave you a foundation. My father reached down, opened the navy binder on the table, and pulled out the original 1991 founding deed of Anchor Heritage Trust. He turned the page to the signature line at the bottom, stamped with a gold state notary seal, and pushed it across the table toward his son. David leaned forward with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the document until they landed on the bold, cursive signature written in dark blue ink at the bottom of the page. Section 4, The Turning of the Tide. The silence in the boardroom was so absolute you could hear the soft humming of the air conditioning vents high above the glass table. David's hands trembled so violently that the paper rattled against the polished walnut surface. He stared at the blue ink signature, reading the name Arthur Pendleton over and over again, as if hoping his eyes were playing a cruel trick on him. This can't be real, David whispered, his voice stripped of all its corporate confidence. He looked up at Senator Vance, pleading with his eyes. Senator, tell me this is a mistake. My father was a site foreman. He worked in construction his whole life. He didn't have $50 million. Senator Vance leaned over the table, his eyes hard as flint. Your father owned 40% of the land under the Outer Belt Highway before you were born, David. He funded your firm, guaranteed your bonds, and paid the lease on the very chair you are sitting in right now. The only mistake Arthur ever made was believing you were mature enough to handle the truth without losing your soul. David sank back into his leather chair. The 6 senior partners around the table were staring at him with a mix of shock and horror. They weren't stupid men. They knew instantly what this revelation meant. The entire financial stability of Pendleton and Vance Capital rested in the hands of the old man, sitting at the head of the table. Dad! David stammered, his face flushing red with shame. I didn't know. You never told me. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to walk tall, David. My father said softly, looking at his son with a sadness that cut deeper than any harsh word. I wanted you to build something of your own without feeling like you were living in your father's shadow. I gave you a foundation, David, but last night you showed me what you built on top of it. My father stood up slowly, relying on his cane for balance. He adjusted his simple blazer and looked at his son, not with rage, but with the quiet authority of a master craftsman inspecting a broken structure. Last night, you told me I didn't fit in at your table, my father continued, his voice echoing in the vast room. You told me I wasn't an important guest. You threw $300 at my feet so your wealthy friends wouldn't have to look at the man whose calloused hands built everything you enjoy. David swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. Dad, please. Last night was an important corporate networking event. I was under immense pressure. The governor's team was there. The governor's team didn't stay up with you when you had a fever of 104 as a child, Senator Vance snapped, cutting David off sharply. Your mother spent 4 hours baking those pies for your table, David, and you made your father leave through the back door like a trespasser. David buried his face in his hands. Dad, I'm sorry. I swear I'm sorry. I'll call everyone back. We'll have a proper family dinner tonight. It's too late for dinner, David, my father replied calmly. You made your choice about who was important. Now, it's time to see how well those important guests hold up your world. My father nodded to Senator Vance. The senator pulled a stack of formal legal notices from his leather briefcase and slid them across the table to Marcus Sterling, the chief operating officer. As of 9:15 this morning, Senator Vance announced formally, the Anchor Heritage Trust is executing Section 14 of the Master Covenant, effective immediately. First, all primary operational credit lines issued to Pendleton and Vance Capital are frozen pending a full forensic audit. Second, the corporate master lease for these executive offices on 4th Street is terminated due to a breach of character covenants. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. Third, the primary liquidity guarantee for the $35 million riverfront development project is hereby revoked. Marcus Sterling gasped, his face draining of all color. He turned to David in sheer panic. David, the escrow deadline for the riverfront project is at noon today. If that $35 million isn't guaranteed by 12 o'clock, we forfeit our $8 million earnest deposit and face immediate breach of contract lawsuits from the state. David bolted out of his chair, leaning over the table, his voice cracking into a desperate scream. Dad, no! You can't do this. That project is my life. If we lose that deposit, the firm goes bankrupt. I'll lose everything. Victoria will leave me. My estate will be foreclosed. My father looked at his son, his expression calm, unyielding and clear. You won't lose everything, David, my father said softly. You'll still have your important guests. You can call them up today. Ask them to guarantee your $35 million. Ask them to pay your rent. See how many of them invite you to their table when you have nothing left to offer them. David stood frozen, tears finally brimming in his eyes, realizing the terrifying truth of his position. None of those high-net-worth investors cared about him. They cared about his money, his influence, and his access. Without the backing of Anchor Heritage, he was nothing to them. Dad, please, David wept, taking a step toward him. Don't destroy me. I'm not destroying you, David, my father said, turning his back to him and walking toward the glass doors. I'm removing the safety net. It's time for you to learn how to stand on your own feet. Section 5, The Collapse of the Empire. The doors of the glass boardroom clicked shut behind me, but the silence inside that room remained heavy enough to suffocate a man. I didn't take the elevator down. My knees were stiff, and my back throbbed with every step, but I took the stairs, listening to the quiet, rhythmic thud of my cane against the concrete steps. With every floor I descended, I felt a strange mixture of profound sorrow and absolute relief. A father never wants to break his child. You spend 30 years shielding them from the harsh winter winds, building walls to keep them warm, taking the hits so they never have to know what a bruise feels like. But when the walls you built become a cage that starves their soul, you have no choice but to tear the structure down to the mud. By 12 o'clock noon, The ripples of what happened in that boardroom turned into a tidal wave that hit the financial district of Columbus. The word spread across the wire services like wildfire. Anchor Heritage Trust suspends all credit lines to Pendleton and Vance Capital. In the world of high-stakes corporate real estate, rumor is blood in the water. At 12:15, the seller's escrow group for the $35 million riverfront development officially declared Pendleton and Vance in default. The $8 million honest deposit, money David had pooled from his firm's operational reserves, was seized immediately under contract terms. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the panic was complete. David sat in his corner office, surrounded by stacked folders, listening to his desk phone ring endlessly. The first calls weren't from creditors. They were from his important guests. "Marcus!" David shouted into his intercom, his voice hoarse, his silk tie pulled loose at his collar. "Get the governor's chief of staff on the phone. Tell him I need a 10-minute meeting." "I tried, David," Marcus replied from the outer desk, his voice completely dead. His assistant said the governor's schedule is full for the next 6 months. They've already removed our firm's name from the Riverfront press release. "What about Vanguard Global?" David slammed his fist onto the desk. "Call Mr. Henderson. He sat at my Thanksgiving table last night. He drank my 50-year-old scotch. Tell him I just need a $15 million short-term bridge loan to cover escrow." A moment later, Marcus walked into the office, carrying his jacket over his arm and holding a box of his personal belongings. "Henderson's secretary answered," Marcus said flatly, setting his office keys on the desk. "She said Mr. Henderson doesn't remember attending any dinner last night. They're pulling their $8 million liquidity portfolio out of our firm by 4 o'clock today." David stared at his COO, his jaw trembling. "Marcus, where are you going?" "I'm leaving, David," Marcus said softly, looking at his former boss with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "The firm is insolvent. By Monday morning, the state licensing board will freeze our trading accounts. It's over. We're partners, Marcus," David pleaded, standing up, his hands shaking violently as he gestured around the luxurious office. "We built this together." "No, David," Marcus replied, stopping at the door and looking back at the velvet armchairs and the grand city view. "Your father built this. You just rented it to pretend you were a king. And you threw him out the back door." By 5 o'clock that evening, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting deep purple shadows across the city. The grand skyscraper on 4th Street was quiet. The marble lobby downstairs, usually buzzing with wealthy clients and assistants, was deserted. The lights in the executive suites were turned off one by one as employees packed their bags and walked out into the cold November evening. In his grand mansion on the river, David's nightmare was only beginning. When he drove a sports car up the circular driveway at 6 o'clock, he found 2 heavy-moving vans parked near the front entrance. Inside, the foyer was filled with luggage. Victoria was standing by the grand staircase, wearing a black wool coat, supervisioned 2 workers who were carefully wrapping artwork. "Victoria!" David gasped, rushing inside, his face pale, his eyes wild with stress. "What is going on here? What are these trucks doing?" Victoria didn't turn around right away. She picked up her leather handbag, checked her compact mirror, and adjusted her lip gloss before turning to face her husband. Her eyes were completely cold, devoid of love, warmth, or concern. "I'm taking Chloe and moving into the downtown penthouse, David," she said smoothly, as if discussing a change in the weather. "What?" David yelled, taking a step toward her. "Victoria, the firm is going through a temporary liquidity freeze. It's a legal dispute with the master trust. It will be sorted out in a few weeks." "Don't lie to me, David," Victoria said, her voice sharp as glass. "My father called me 3 hours ago. Your credit lines are dead. The bank has already issued a preliminary attachment notice on this house because the master lease wasn't renewed. In 30 days, federal marshals will be standing on this lawn. Victoria, please." David dropped to his knees in the marble foyer, grabbing her hand, tears finally streaming down his face. "I need you. We're a family. We can get through this. We can move into a smaller place while I rebuild." Victoria pulled her hand back sharply, stepping away from him with a look of intense disgust. "Move into a smaller place," she scoffed, letting out a cruel, bitter laugh. "David, I didn't marry a warehouse worker's son to live in a suburban tract house. I married the CEO of Pendleton and Vance Capital. If you don't have the firm, you don't have anything to offer me. I loved you. David sobbed, sitting on the cold marble floor where 24 hours earlier he had thrown $300 at my feet. I gave you everything you ever asked for. The jewelry, the trips, this house. You gave me what you bought with your father's trust, Victoria replied coldly, walking toward the grand front doors. And now the bill has come due. She didn't look back. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the vast, empty mansion like a tomb closing. David sat alone on the cold tile under the massive crystal chandelier. The house was silent. The champagne was gone. The music had stopped. The important guests had all went home. For the first time in his life, the self-made prodigy was left alone in the dark, surrounded by the hollow shell of a life built on sand. The next 6 months were a long, quiet winter for David. The fall from the top of the mountain is never gentle, but when you fall from a height built entirely on someone else's sacrifices, the ground hits with absolute brutality. By mid-December, Pendleton and Vance Capital was gone. Without the $35 million liquidity guarantee from Anchor Heritage Trust, the riverfront deal fell apart in a matter of hours. The $8 million earnest deposit was forfeited. When news broke across the financial wire that the firm's credit lines had been frozen by its master trust, the important guests vanished like smoke in a gale. The high-net-worth investors pulled their capital within 48 hours. The political contacts stopped answering his calls. David's wife, Victoria, didn't stay to see the aftermath. The moment the long-term lease on their $8 million estate was revoked and the sports cars were repossessed by the leasing company, she filed for divorce. She packed her designer trunks, moved into a luxury high-rise apartment downtown funded by her father, and took custody of little Chloe, leaving David in a small, rented 2-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city, a neighborhood he hadn't stepped foot in since high school. He had no grand corner office. He had no tailored suits. He had no entourage of sycophants laughing at his jokes. For the first time in his life, David was just a 34-year-old man sitting in an empty room, surrounded by cardboard boxes, listening to the hum of a cheap refrigerator. It was a cold Saturday afternoon in late April when I finally drove my old pickup truck down the narrow residential street in West Columbus. The spring rain had just washed the dust off the pavement, and green shoots were beginning to poke through the dark earth along the sidewalks. I parked the truck in front of a small, red brick duplex, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, looking at the porch. David was sitting on the wooden steps, wearing an old gray sweatshirt and worn jeans. His hair was longer, unstyled, and his face was thinner than it had been at the Thanksgiving gala. Beside him on the step was a tackle box and a wooden toolbox. He was using a wire brush to clean rust off an old set of pipe wrenches. He looked up as my truck pulled to the curb. For a second, I saw a flicker of the old shame cross his face, but he didn't run inside. He didn't hide. He slowly stood up, set the wrench down on the step, and wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag. I stepped out of the truck, resting my hand on my cane, and walked up the short concrete walkway. "Hello, David," I said softly. "Hi, Dad," David replied. His voice was quiet, stripped of all the sharp, hurried arrogance that used to define every word he spoke. We stood in silence for a long moment, the cool spring breeze blowing between us. "How are you holding up?" I asked, looking at the toolbox beside him. "I got a job," David said, offering a small, faint smile, the first genuine smile I had seen on his face in 5 years. Assistant manager at a local logistics warehouse over on 3rd Avenue. It doesn't pay much, $60,000 a year, but it pays the rent. I nodded slowly. $60,000 is a good living if you know what it costs to make it. David looked down at his calloused hands that were no longer manicured, hands that now held the faint stains of engine grease and cardboard dust. "I deserve everything that happened, Dad," David whispered, his eyes filling with quiet tears that he didn't try to hide. "I spent 10 years thinking I was better than the man who built me. I looked at your boots, your old truck, your union stories, and I was ashamed. I was so damn ashamed of where I came from because I wanted those strangers in suits to accept me." He wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, taking a shaky breath. "When I threw that money at your feet on Thanksgiving, I didn't just disrespect you. I threw away the only real thing I had in my life. I haven't slept a full night since that morning. Every time I close my eyes, I see you walking down those steps into the rain holding Mom's pies. I walked up the porch steps, set my cane against the railing, and sat down on the top step beside him, just like we used to do when he was 10 years old after a baseball game. Your mother used to say that concrete takes time to cure, David, I said quietly, looking out at the quiet street. If you pour it too fast, it cracks under the sun. If you don't lay down the steel rebar first, the whole building comes down in the first storm. You move too fast, son. You wanted the roof before you built the walls. David sat beside me, his shoulders slumped, listening to every word like a starving man waiting for bread. I didn't take Anchor Heritage away to destroy you, David, I continued, turning to look at him. I took it away because as long as that safety net was under you, you were never going to learn what money is actually worth. Money isn't respect. It isn't honor. It's just a tool. If you use it to build walls between you and the people who love you, it becomes a cage. David buried his face in his hands, his chest heaving as silent sobs shook his frame. I'm sorry, Dad. God, I'm so sorry. I reached out, placed my big, calloused hand on his shoulder, and pulled my son close to me. I know you are, son, I whispered, tears warming my own eyes. I know you are. 1 year later, on Thanksgiving Day, the sun was shining brightly over my small brick house in Ohio. The air in the kitchen was thick with the rich, sweet scent of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh apple pies cooling on silver wire racks by the window. The front door opened, and the sound of sweet, high-pitched laughter echoed down the hallway. Grandpa! 8-year-old Chloe came running into the kitchen, her red shoes tapping rhythmically against the linoleum floor. She threw her arms around my waist, hugging me tight. Happy Thanksgiving, Grandpa! She cheered, looking up at me with bright, happy eyes. Happy Thanksgiving, my little lady. I laughed, kneeling down to kiss her forehead. Behind her walked David. He was wearing a simple dark blue sweater and clean jeans. He looked healthy, strong and grounded. He was carrying a wooden crate filled with fresh vegetables from the local market. Over the last 12 months, David had worked his way up to shift supervisor at the warehouse. He had rented a small, comfortable house with a backyard for Chloe's weekend visits. He paid his own bills, managed his own budget, and spent every Sunday afternoon sitting on my porch, learning how to fix old engines and work with wood. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He didn't have a corner office or a spot on corporate boards. But when he walked into a room, he walked with the quiet, sturdy confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. Smells like Mom's kitchen, David said, setting the crate on the counter and giving me a warm, firm embrace. It is Mom's kitchen. I smiled, patting his back. She'd be proud of you today, David. At 4 o'clock, the doorbell rang again. David opened the door to welcome our guests. Old Senator Richard Vance, looking sharp as ever, along with my retired neighbor, Tom, and a couple of young construction workers from my old union, local, who didn't have family in town for the holidays. We sat down around the long wooden dining table in my simple dining room. There were no white marble floors, no crystal chandeliers, and no valets parked outside. Just good people, hot food, and warm laughter filling every corner of the house. David stood up at the head of the table, holding his glass of water. He looked around at the faces seated together, the senator, the union workers, his daughter, and his father. Before we eat, David said, his voice steady and rich with emotion, I want to say a few words. 2 years ago, I thought an important guest was someone with a title, a high net worth account, or an expensive suit. I was blind, arrogant, and foolish. He turned to me, his eyes shining with deep gratitude. I learned the hard way that the most important guests at any table are the ones who helped you get there, the people who sacrificed their comfort so you could have a future, the people who call you out when you lose your way, and the people who love you enough to pick you up when you fall. David raised his glass. To the foundation, and to my father. To Arthur, Senator Vance said, raising his glass high, followed by everyone at the table. As the clinking of glasses filled the room, and Chloe reached for another slice of apple pie, I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the autumn sun setting over the golden trees. True wealth isn't measured by the height of the skyscrapers you build or the millions sitting in a bank ledger. It's measured by the strength of the foundation beneath your feet, the integrity of the life you live, and the love of the people sitting at your table. When you build your life on truth, humility, and respect, there is no storm in this world that can ever tear your house down.